for those of you who weren't with us last night when we were having the first session of this colloquium, the structure of this is going to be two 20-minute presentations with 20 minutes of discussion between them, and then 20 minutes after the second one. We have two presenters tonight. The first is going to be Peter Hasdell, Associate Professor at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University School of Design. And then Charlie O'Gene, what's your title? Sorry, Charlie, are you a...
That's a great question. I think I'm a visiting instructor.
Visiting instructor at Texas Tech University, and you know, also a friend of mine who goes back a couple years. So with that in mind, I think we could probably just get started. A couple other kind of notes about things that have been happening in the chat is that I posted the YouTube video from last night's discussion on my YouTube channel, and I will also distribute the video files. But with that, I'll kind of cut myself off. And Peter, whenever you're ready, go for it.
Sure. Just give me 1 second.
So it seems like Marcus is not able to join us tonight. He's got some computer trouble, which is really critical these days. But Marcus Wernley, Dr. Marcus Wernley is the last contributor to the colloquium, and tomorrow night he'll be talking about, so he and I have been working in Tayo Village together, and so I will give my talk, which is kind of a larger, like over kind of broader themes, and then Marcus is going to discuss some of the sanitation related work that he's doing there. So that's what will happen tomorrow night. All right, sorry.
Okay, Dan, you need to allow me to share screen.
Try now?
Yep. You guys can see that?
Yep.
Okay. Tonight I want to talk about two projects, one very, very old one and one that's very, very recent. Part of this relates to my recent kind of work, or work since 2014, which is called In Situ Project, which I do together with Kuo Zhi, who's a Taiwanese guy who also sometimes works in our school as well. And our platform's called In Situ Project. In Situ, as you know, is, it means like in-site or local site, local condition, and so on. And we work really, really intensively in some very local situation, mostly in China. I'll just go back here for a minute. So the title of my talk anyway is called House of Dreams, which relates to the second project. But, you know, in a speculative way, I want to call this towards an indeterminate architecture, which I'll try to explain a little bit, hopefully clear or not. Coming back to In Situ Project, we set this up really about 2014-15, and we do very site-specific things, not just projects, but sometimes events, like a lot of workshop training sessions, working with students also in some location, but sometimes just working with local communities, local rural villages and so forth across China. So we do some of these things. Actually, how we started was more on a participatory design and research base. But increasingly, it's kind of moved a bit sideways from that. While we still embody the kind of participatory approach, I don't really want to discuss that too much today in this case. So I want to start with 4 or 5 kind of series of questions. The first relates to this image by Leonardo da Vinci. It's called Cloudburst of Material Possessions. And I always found this really fantastic, right? You can see rakes, you can see bottles, you can see all sorts of just general crap that we use, discard, gets broken, you know, forms new layers on the ground and so on. And the reason I want to show this, hopefully will become a little bit apparent later on when I talk about the House of Dreams. But it also speaks to a question, at least my interpretation on matter itself, like the stuff we make things of, and when they actually become, they fall out of use, they become, you know, we've consumed them, we've kind of left them, we've forgotten them, and so on. And then maybe also how perhaps new geological layers can be made from these things in a kind of anthropocenic way, I guess. Second thing, some of you very familiar with this much more than I am, maybe. This is also Gordon Matter Clark. And then a long time ago, when I was a student of architecture, I read something about how he was supposed to give a lecture on archaeology somewhere in Mexico. And he apparently realized he didn't know anything about archaeology in this architecture or archaeology school, but he was staying in this motel, roadside motel, that was long and linear, apparently. I couldn't find the reference, so I don't include it here. But and while he was staying in this motel in Mexico, he realized that one end was falling down, it was in a ruinous state, and the other end, they were building new rooms or new motel rooms and facilities for this motel. So apparently he spoke about this, the archaeology of this kind of drive-in motel in Mexico somewhere. But the kind of illustration of his work, which we're familiar with, the sort of carving of holes in what later became the Pompidou site, to actually construct something out of sort of unmaking or demaking or whatever you want to call that, or the cutting out, the elision of different parts of some of the houses that he split or removed, and then recontextualizing these things. It's part of the same kind of process. It's part of a sort of continual making, unmaking, remaking process. Perhaps we kind of call it in a very nice way recycling today. But I think there's actually other factors at play in this. Not at least the sort of human effort, the physical effort, the manifestation of new things within this, new relationships, new kind of geometries, if you like, tectonics, as Clint was talking about yesterday, but also the need for some kind of physical embodiment, material substrate of these things, I think is at least important in my work. The third thing I want to discuss is something I've been kind of fascinated by in a, etymological way, right? So you can have something called thing. Nowadays we regard thing as an object, but actually if you look back at it, then a thing quite often was something that was debated in a particular assembly, and the assembly was actually in kind of ancient Old English or Old German was called this assembly itself, right? So you might get some kind of foreign object that it's not quite accepted in language in that community or society, and then you have to actually debate whether that is part of the value set, the kind of named noun things within that society. So I found it quite interesting, this kind of duality. Why is it interesting to me? Because then this assembly speaks about some kind of social process, debate, discussion, argument, whatever. And the thing is the kind of material base that comes into this place. This is, so you can read this little quote at the bottom by Bjorgen Vincent and N, right, where he says, they say things are assemblies, rituals, and places where disputes were resolved and political decisions were made. The picture on the top is from one of the projects I will show later on, but some students picked up this, which is seaworn concrete, but it actually looks like stone, some kind of conglomerate stone. So I think the thing to me represents some kind of relational process that's not just physical material, i.e. non-human, and it's not just the assembly, but it's that constant toing and froing between these things. Related to this is a word I've also been fascinated by, concept, word, whatever you want to call it, which is articulation. Now we kind of know what this means. You can talk about articulated truck or how bones or a joint, can move and so on, but it also means to articulate a thought or an idea. And then in architecture means, you know, those details, those joints, those connections that we make that actually, in a certain way, turn space into architecture, because then we can understand that's a dado line, that's a kind of architrave, that's a, you know, certain things become markers of a particular story in that particular architecture. So again, you can see the sort of little images. That's also from, you know, the project I'll show later on, where students had identified a particular stone on the ground and written a problem on it, or taken advantage to make some kind of sculptural symbolic entity. So for me, the kind of detail, the material detail of this is really, really super important. And then to get a little bit more conceptual, I don't really want to go super sort of conceptual about this, but there is a lot written about this. Usually I find this quite a bit too conceptual with not enough application. You know, how do we turn, let's say, socio-material assemblages from Latour into actual physical things? And I think we would always be kind of disappointed in how they never fully become realized. But Latour borrows from Michel Serres, who writes of quasi-objects, you know, things that are not quite a thing and not quite a kind of social or human relationship. But he's also talking about the kind of relationship between these two things, distinction between subject and object, for example. I think these things mean that, you know, whenever we construct stuff, that we actually have to engage with some of these processes. And sometimes in architecture, we forget about this. So it just becomes, okay, I'm compiling things from a material catalog or building system or structural system and so on. But the assemblage is really something that, you know, tries to embody a certain kind of difference within these things. So these are just some kind of questions I have about these things. You know, how can we work as architects with relational worlds? What does it mean for design process? Do we become agents that actually mediate within these types of things themselves? So without further ado, I want to just jump into the first of the projects. This is very, very old. I was still a student at this time, and I'd met these other two characters, Anders Johansson and then Tim Jackner. And we had a very small workshop, a 10-day workshop in the Shetland Islands, which is north of Scotland, in the middle of basically North Sea, or where Atlantic sort of is very wild and windswept. So we went there in summer 1993, and we made a stone house with about 40 participants, most of who were architecture students. But we said, as part of the structure of this, nobody will be the designer. The whole 40 of us will design this, but we can't kind of negotiate between 40 people. So we said there's 4 different groups. Each group is responsible for one wall, and then however we proceed with the house, you can see maybe where I'm going with the indeterminacy. You know, it's not a kind of regulated, highly structured house where everything is, you know, millimeter perfect. So if you want 2 walls to meet, they have to negotiate. As part of this, you know, then there's something called Croft House in Scotland, which is a sort of vernacular house, sometimes with a boat on top, sometimes just built by stacking stones. As you can see, there's very little timber on these places. So we adopted similar kind of approach. This is one wall of the finished house. On the lower 3 images, you can see some of the other walls. So you can see this in the top image, you see the top left corner. This is very, very well constructed in terms of stacking up stones. So this group had a very good relationship with the group in the bottom left image. So their corner and the intersection, the construction is very, very tightly connected. What does this mean for me? That means that the social collaboration of these groups matches up with the physical construction of this. But if you look at other parts, then you will see problems, issues, things that are going to fall down in 5 or 10 years. So as part of our structure, we said there's a certain kind of demand each group can make on another group. And then there was a certain kind of communication process so that if one group wanted a window in the opposite wall, they could issue a demand on that wall, but they would have to deal with the demands from the other group as well. So this is kind of reciprocal thing was just our artificial way how we could actually try to structure relationships across the house, across the space, and so on. So you can see that there's certain details, change of stone or triangular windows or weird shaped entries that you know, somebody else had demanded that group put in. So the text here, I'm not going to read it, but you know, indicates some of the demands that the groups had. But if we just go, I'll go through this quite quickly. So Shetland Islands here, this is our site plan. It's oriented the wrong way, so north is that way. This is the bay where we were, it's called Sandviken, and you can see no trees, right? Very windswept, very open. Here is a kind of schematic of how we did. So we asked actually students to go out in the landscape, collect, interestingly enough, things we called things, right? So we said, okay, go and collect 3 things. And the 3 things then translate into the demands, and the demands translate into the another wall. So if you're building one wall, you have 3 demands, you can make one on each of the other walls. So the things they collected were observation, objects, split stones, for example, things like this. And then these things were sort of like totems or something like that that allowed the some kind of physical manifestation of a communication process. Here's a sort of matrix of some of those things and some of the demands. This was actually from the time. And then this was the instructions, almost like building instructions for the other groups that they had to kind of do. So this was a kind of interesting experiment. You know, here's some more demands, as you can see. This is a plan we draw afterwards of the, like archaeology, we draw this after we've finished construction itself. Here's a detail of one of the demands, the manifestation of demands. So somebody said, put these flat stones in your curved stone wall. And here's part of the process of that. So you can see negotiation happening where maybe 2 walls have to meet or where there's some kind of detail occurring and so on. So it's kind of like an interesting experiment, which I could not repeat for many, many years. He's completed the house in its context. So moving on to, sorry, let me check time. Okay, I've got to speed up a bit. Moving on to the second project I want to discuss. This is something that in situ projects, mostly my collaborator Quo did. I contributed to stage 2, but we started this project in 2018. We work with a lot of a local community group who is quite amazing. There's this elderly woman who moved to the village 20 years ago and started to reorganize, restructure all the aging people in this village. This is in Zhoushan in Henan province. It is on the edge of the kind of cave. In part of China, there's a kind of cave area. So this is not the main cave, this sunken cave things, but it's on one of the edges of this whole region. Anyway, what this woman had done, she's typical of many villages in China. The working age population moved to the coast in, I don't know, 1990s and left behind the elderly population and a whole bunch of kids. So a lot of the elderly people are 60 plus, 65, 70 or something like this. And then some had retired, some were, you know, kind of content in their individuality, but the the sort of community spirit had kind of gone. Now, these people grew up within these caves. So sometime in the 1960s, 70s or whatever, they'd moved out of these caves and moved into, sorry, let me see if this will run. Had moved into, turn off the sound, had moved into houses, normal houses built on the kind of ridges behind these villages. So one thing they did was they sort of, once we started this whole process of using the kind of community reorganization that Lian Jun, this elderly woman, had done with the community, was to find a site where they could set up a kind of rural development research and training base. And then eventually we found this kind of cave site. And then they kind of understood this as a part of their collective dreams, collective memory, if you like, of their childhood. Hence the villagers decided to call it House of Dreams. Now this is part of the, some detail, I just want to zoom on a bit. So this is some of the workshop things we've done with the whole community, where they're actually looking at community paving things where everyone starts to use secondhand recycled construction materials, many of which they had stored for, 20, 30 years behind the house they lived in, brought down, and then these things gradually became kind of collective memory for the villagers themselves. So it just goes through this flyover, then we move on. So here is part of the whole scheme. In the end, it was roughly 20 caves. We did new amenities blocks, 3 of them. There's a new staircase access to the village above. And then within this process, here's the houses they live in now, right? Rather than the caves themselves. Let's move on from that. So here you can see a rough part of the plan. There's an upper level plan. You can see some of the caves we refurbished here. Number 2 is amenities block. Number 5 is a kind of laundry room. Number 4 is a dining room and community kitchen, and so on. So we pretty much refurbished the whole thing. Some bits are new built, some bits are old. And we did this using, in many ways, sort of recycled construction materials. Now, in the beginning, as I'll show, here's just some views of construction process. Here's some more views of that. You can see somehow some interesting wall textures, which I'll talk about in a second. But as part of this whole development process, we, together with the elderly woman who runs this community, decided that they wanted to train the elderly people in recycling of construction waste and material into these caves, into retaining walls, cave ceilings, new buildings, and so on. So most typically is this kind of entry wall I'll talk about further. So again, just some construction things and details. So the villagers gradually became trained in these things, in the beginning quite reluctantly, because they thought, why are we using these old things? But then increasingly, as the project went on over a couple of years, became super enthusiastic about how they could build in the materials, the kind of things that they discarded or thought were waste into these new buildings as part of their collective memory. So I think Clint talked about some things like this yesterday as well. So here you can see part of the initial workshop for stage 1. Here you can see some old tiles, bits of old masonry used within a cave retaining wall. Here is the main village entry wall. You see fan, you see an old clock, you see ceramic pots, you see bits of everything, grinding wheel for maize, old bottles, bits of modern buildings that have been demolished, the tile, green, white tile things, and so forth. Now, how do we do that? We just, as in situ projects, of course, the design process is participatory, so we have to negotiate each one of these things. But this is a more detailed example, but quite often we just do a very schematic design. So as the project evolved, our role as architect became less and less important, because the villagers the community groups became more and more skilled. So basically, by the end of this whole project, we are pretty much redundant within this whole process. So you can see them here constructing the main village wall. Oddly enough, they put my name on there, which is weird, but it's all the contributors on this. You can see a kind of map of where they collected all the materials. So these little white ceramic lines represent part of the village where they gathered these things, and just a whole variety of textures. And they're super proud of this. They're really, really happy with this. So as well as the kind of the main village wall, which come in the second stage, you know, this also affected cave walls, reuse of old demolished buildings, timber screen, etc., into this. But also the writing of particular message meanings into different patterns on pavements, floors, etc. As well, then they went out to the local mountains, and found this particular kind of stones that then they were very proud to, they're called ginger stone, they're very proud to construct into one of the new bathroom blocks, this kind of highly textured little thing. They play around with brick patterns. We just push them, provoke them a bit to, you know, be able to preserve the trees. So we cast them around split ceramic pots and so on. So the whole thing become very experimental. This is maybe the third sort of final, most recent stage of it, where this is a dining hall and amenities block. You can see the inside of it where the old grandmother sitting here with part of the elderly community, but they're using all sorts of different things, whether it's leftover bits of wood, bottles, old windows, again, grinding wheels, records, air conditioner covers, and so on. So there's all of these walls start to tell a story, because many of the parts come from demolished or discarded things that people had in their own houses. Third part of this is that the caves themselves, because we made some new ones. So the bottom left one is actually a new cantilever structure that sits on a kind of I-beam. Some of the other ones are refurbished caves, the one next to that, and so on. Some are tunnels, some are just an arch roof. But there was a conscious decision to make every single cave different, because this is House of Dreams, so they should allow for as many different interpretations of memories of how it was to live there. You can see in the bottom left some of the caves before we fixed them up, like this. Some of them were pretty run down. So here you can see part of some of the finished images of this. Just to wrap it up, then what do I mean by indeterminate architecture? I mean something that, you know, no longer as an architect, you're in 100% control of all of the domains, right? The whole drawing process, the whole construction process, the design process, and so on. So that by engaging, let's say, this elderly construction team, there's a lot of things that we don't know. We actually get very positively surprised by their interpretation, their rapid improvement in construction skills, the interpretation even of some of our drawings, and overall framework design for what they're doing. You know, so they kind of engage this whole social group, this whole social process into the whole control of the designer, the architect, as the sort of, you know, arbiter of control within a process. So that means, for me anyway, this becomes a bit like the stone house, indeterminate. You get this kind of weird blend of overall construction or parts of the construction that no longer represent the architect's wish in that way, but much more the sort of collective, their embodiment of a collective will within the project itself. At least that's my interpretation, but I welcome any other divergent understanding of this. So I find this quite exciting, because actually it's a sort of, I don't know, social architecture, social material architecture, it leads to things that you don't expect as outcomes. But also perhaps interestingly in the village, the last project I showed, you know, it's led to a whole sort of shift in mentality on on material itself, right? It's no longer something you just discard, use it, discard it. It becomes part of a new substrate, right? Oddly enough, in the caves which sit under the new houses, it becomes a kind of recycling or continual remaking process, like I talked about with Gordon Matter Clark. So I'm gonna perhaps stop it there. I have more. These are other projects, but if you're interested, you can find out these on In Situ Media website or Instagram. But I prefer not to go on that. I think I better stop so we keep the time. I'll just leave it on that. Is that okay, Dan?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Peter. So yeah, amazing presentation. Thank you. And as before, with each presenter, we'll have around 20 minutes of discussion over the presentation, which, you know, just to kind of start off, I'd welcome any comments from our other contributors or the audience. So I'll kind of stay quiet for a minute, and if we need to, I'll ask some questions. I see Mike's got his hand up, so go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Peter. That was great. Lots of really interesting thoughts, and I enjoy the questions that you're asking as well. So, I mean, it made me think this idea of embedded memory and assemblage, or also socio-material assemblage, made me think of it's a client and friend, an artist, a guy called Willie Bester, who's also a friend. Clint is also good friends with him. So he uses recycled materials to make his art and assemblages, and it's really interesting because he says he really struggles with competitions because they always want a little maquette or a model of what the artwork's going to be, and he says he doesn't know. He just starts working and with an idea in his head, and it kind of evolves as he goes. So it really speaks to this idea of indeterminacy. I'll just plop his website in here in the chat. But he does some really interesting stuff, and a lot of his work is political and social commentary, and he also talks about this idea of embedded memory and how it's about social commentary, how the work itself becomes a social commentary. And it refers to the other artists in Africa also work with this idea and with recycled content. So there are quite a few. I'll share them in due course. But yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to look at. The other interesting thing was also this dialogue that you mentioned with the Stonehouse, where the different groups, wall groups, the more successful ones had a good dialogue, and the others not so much. So it made me think about this thing of dialogue, having the dialogue at the same time, but also with things like adaptive reuse architecture or this kind of work, that you're having a dialogue across time with a previous artist or architect or maker, and how successful or unsuccessful those dialogues can sometimes be, but just working across time. So yeah, lots of interesting stuff to think about. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, probably what I didn't do is talk about the colloquium theme so much, the manifest initiative. But one thing that perhaps I ran out of time or didn't structure it in, but one thing that I think is quite important for the way that In Situ project tried to work is that a lot of these moments of translation, right? So we go from, or transformation. So you might go from a community dialogue. So this project here is one of, in a different village, one we did with, we did a couple of projects here, but one of them, you know, was, both of them were actually to do with participatory design process. So we have to engage the villagers within certain kind of dialogue, looking at their needs, looking at their potentials, and then trying to understand, facilitate the transformation moments within this, where you go from maybe talk or individual opinion to collective opinion to plan of action to, you know, construction. We don't use drawings, we tend to use models like you guys were also talking about yesterday. So we can actually communicate with them, and then people can actually come to some kind of broad-based agreement. It's not even consensus sometimes there's kind of dissenting parties to this. But each moment is a kind of transformative thing, you know, each translation moment, and we try to avoid those things falling into the kind of inertial trap within this. Sometimes we make mistakes as well. So, you know, for instance, this one here is a guest house, which was designed after we'd done a kind of community kitchen in this village. And this one in particular, we hadn't factored in well enough the fact that the villagers had no skill in running a guest house. I mean, it's a very basic wood village. They're quite poor. So we, even though we set up social enterprise together with our that was the software to our hardware, which is the guest house, we hadn't really properly understood the capacity of the village itself to run a guest house, for instance. So yeah, we make mistakes in this case sometimes, but always try to avoid this, retaining the control by the architects or by the designer or whatever, and just being able to facilitate the transformation, whatever it is, wherever it is, however it is, in a kind of open process as much as we can. And that's the same whether it's this wood village or the cave village, that way.
Sounds like you had better soft skills than we did. I think in terms of failures on our side as well, I think the soft skills were maybe outside our skill set. So the guys I showed yesterday, we taught to make building blocks with recycled bottles. So once they knew how to make them, and we left them with all the tools and materials, but to potentially set up a little business, but that never took off. And I think maybe it's due in part to us not really understanding how to do mentorship and not necessarily having the time to stay on the ground and kind of work through things like marketing and networking and setting up technological networks, which I think Daniel knows more about. But yeah, so I think that's maybe a limitation into what we do.
Yeah, I can't take credit for that, but what we do, I mean, not all, but I suck at those kind of social skills. But what we tend to do, In Situ Project does, and I set this up from the very beginning, is to work with the social sciences, social worker, embedded social workers. So in this village or in the Stone Village, it's either a social work organization or it's that grandmother who is by proxy this kind of social work organization, or in another place it might be an NGO who is very socially oriented. So then they might need our skills, which include architecture and, I don't know, workshops and things like this. You know, understanding of the material crafts and skills within the village and so on. So those skills, if we can align them up together, and I think you guys referred to that a bit yesterday, then that actually can be a very fruitful collaboration. So those soft skills, let's say we want to set up a social enterprise or social organization to operate things, then we definitely rely on them to do that, because we, at least in the beginning, we didn't have the capacity to be able to set that up ourselves. So, and such a typical one, they might not make that much money. They might make very, very low level money. So a community kitchen might be run by 5 elderly women. We've done 3 or 4 of them, but then they will work out who benefits from that, what percentage of the benefit goes back to community development, for instance, healthcare for the elderly, helping kids with education, village civic development, and so on. but it's low amounts of money. And then this is kind of agreed within a community itself. But I don't have the skills to do that myself. So we really rely on those people who operate within that, who have social or cultural skills.
And did you have something to ask or add?
Sorry, could I?
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So Peter, thank you for a really wonderful presentation. It's really inspiring. In a way, I think you might have just answered the question that I had before you. I really found it quite. I mean, when you were talking about not having the soft skills to work with it and collaborating with other sort of groups. My kind of comment was really around this, this idea of when you talked about matter, and for me it was really kind of, the life of a material after it's been completely used. So how do you make it useful again? How do you make it fit for contemporary use in terms of materials? And that for me was quite interesting, because it also begs the question as how do we as architects become useful, in with regards to sort of contemporary issues out there, and working together in these kinds of settings. I think the idea of co-creating knowledge is obviously particularly important, and for that to happen, I think as architects we have to somehow show some level of vulnerability within the process, and I think that kind of requires kind of a letting go of the preconceived ideas that we have that's been instilled with us in terms of how we've been taught and the architectural references that are sort of out there. So I kind of wanted to know, with the House of Dreams, there was kind of a bit of a framework there because of the existing, and that kind of allows some sort of way of holding sort of things together, so people could obviously do quite freely what they wanted to do within that space, and somehow that overall framework is kind of keeps it together. How would you approach something if there is kind of less of a framework, less of an existing sort of out there, and to somehow be relevant still as an architect, but providing that looseness for others to sort of contribute meaningfully and still be part of the process. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, no, very good question. It's not an easy one. I think the remit of in situ project is to kind of work with the very local skills. So if and when we have time and resources, then we might try to work out if we can collaborate with the village themselves. And there's a number of factors that some projects we tend to slightly stay away from. Some of them are where it's just simply need. And NGOs, certain kind of NGO or whatever, I don't know, might be better suited towards doing something there. For us, we want to understand the village's capacity, the local kind of, I don't know, material economy, if you like, the skills, the kind of substrate, in this case it's caves, so they have earth and masonry as their primary materials to work with. So if you look at the images on the lower left, right, these are pretty basic, but people lived in these for a few hundred years. They lost the skills. So when we come back to this, then we say, okay, let's look at how we can reinvigorate some of the skills. Now, that involves certain kind of training things. So for instance, there were some builders involved in the cave reconstruction, and then the villagers involved in different other parts of the non-structural parts of the reconstruction. But there is a certain kind of resistance in the beginning. So we had to do a number of training workshops, and everyone in the beginning is like, oh, why do we want to use this old materials, right? Why do we want to use discarded masonry and old bricks and old windows and so forth? But so we have to actually, a bit like with the building you showed yesterday, Clint, that you did, we have to reconstruct a kind of narrative around that. So in the very first part where they did the courtyard, which is part, you can't really see it here, but it's the lower left image, then they actually donated materials they had lying around, old roof tiles that probably from their grandmother's house or something, right? But these things did have some kind of collective memory or individual memory for them. And once they could see that that was actually, you know, that part of their whatever grandmother's roof tiles become embedded in the paving of this thing, then they become kind of proud for that, and the storyline begins to take off like that. But yes, of course, there were several steps, but by the end of this project, after 3 years, then they're really, really keen. So no training necessary, like everything, they extended out instead of just getting, you know, residual construction materials at the back of their current house. Then they would scout the whole neighborhood, go further out, get not just construction waste material, but also household waste, the fans, the old ceramic pots that were cracked and so on, the beer bottles and all of this stuff. And then that become a kind of, it's no longer a narrative we have to push, but something that starts to have its own momentum. And probably within the very early stone house, we accidentally, well, we structured that, but I mean, you know, in the beginning, there's a lot of resistance because people, there's 40 architecture students who were pretty much the same age as I was when I did the workshop. They were saying, oh, but I can design a stone house in 5 minutes and then we build mine. And then somebody else says, no, we built mine. So there's a lot of resistance in the beginning. Once that process had started, then there's a whole momentum that just takes over. And then whoever, me as the workshop organizer, or in case of in situ project, us as the architects, our role becomes less and less.
Yeah.
Hope that answers your question. But yeah, there's a narrative.
No, yeah, I think it's really interesting, you know, the kind of reframing of what is the image of aspiration. Because, you know, people aspire to certain things and there's an image attached to that, you know, in popular culture, and that's what and I think that's where the question comes, you know, why these sort of materials, why do we have to use this? And so I do think it's about reframing those things. The other thing, just my last comment was, I found it quite interesting as well when you describe, you know, thingness, which is sort of really, you know, just from listening to you, is kind of really this product of social engagement, and really represents sort of collective enterprise or collective effort. And within that is obviously tensions because of certain personalities. I want this, I want that sort of thing. And I think it's quite important because those kind of compromises that students have to make, or this give and take, really shapes them to kind of work collectively. And I really think it speaks to the idea of the citizen architect that I think that's what I'm referring to. I just wanted to know maybe just your thoughts on some feedback from students, how they've found that experience with the Stonehouse particularly.
Yeah, sometimes the material substrate, right, these stones, we had to kind of lever them out of the ground, and then some of them are like 3-person stones, right? They're kind of heavy. So that it slows down the thought process, right? You can get a fat pencil and you can sketch it in 2 minutes, but in this way, then the sort of resistance of that medium actually put in a different mindset, I would say. I don't know how to explain it better, but so in the beginning, the kind of physical resistance, the resistance to conventional design process, right? I can draw it, I can design it, was quite high. In the end, then they're really positive. So at that time, there was the Yugoslavian war on, and there was a guy, he came from the middle of really war-torn part of that, I don't know where, Zagreb or something. And then he said, he came up to me, I was there making sure on a rainy day that the students had a day off. And on a rainy day, the cement was, I forgot to put it under a plastic tarpaulin because we used a little bit of cement. And then he came down there, he didn't go on the study trips with the other students. He said, you know, you guys should come to my country and sort it out. And I thought, wow, that's way too much, right? But it was very nice because he was one of the most reluctant people in the beginning, like, oh, I want to do this, we should do like this. And then he somehow within a week or 2 weeks, he changed his kind of attitude. And that was beautiful to see, right? And the same way that some of these elderly people, 60, 70 years old, who make this astonishing wall, also changed their attitude from, why do we do that? Why do we want to use this old stuff here, to now look at what we've done in that way. But having a material base for this, that they can think, express through this, keep in mind that at least in many of the villages in China we work in, that they're not very educated, articulate, you know, so we, like you, we use models to communicate in many cases. Can't use drawings, they may not understand. They do now, but in the beginning they didn't understand. So that part of this is also just doing something with material. You can see it, you can understand it, you can feel a certain kind of achievement or pride that you achieve that collectively or individually.
So with that, we probably should call that the end of the section.
So,
And yeah, I mean, if anybody has any last comments, we can kind of squeeze them in there. It's no problem. But any other contributions people would like to make? Okay, so if that's it for the first discussion session, thank you, Peter. Really amazing. It's great to see that work. Thank you for joining us today. And with that, I think we can transition to Charlie Eugene's work. And same as before, around, you know, I'm not really moderating time on speakers, so it's no worries at all. I'm mostly keeping track of the discussion sessions. And Charlie, for people that weren't here when I introduced you to our other colleagues, Charlie works at Texas Tech University. Is there any other introductory information you'd like to give?
No, that's good enough. I had a question for Peter, but I have a feeling it's going to come up anyway. I realized why you curated the two of us together, so I think there's a lot of really great sort of overlapping themes.
We can take the time if you want to. I mean, it's all about the discussion.
No. I have a feeling it'll come up somehow.
Okay.
So I mean, hopefully, hopefully at the end it'll be a bit more of a dialogue between us, which would be nice. So yeah, I can get going if you want. All right, you guys can all see this, and hopefully you can't see my notes at the side. All right, great.
Looks good.
Perfect. So, yeah, like Peter, I'm really interested in site specific work and recycling, kind of upcycling and experiment with found material. So today I'd like to talk about 3 very different projects. 2 of them were kind of temporary experiments, and one of them, the last project, is more of a site-based building system. So for me, I see site as material. You know, sometimes that material becomes something to experiment with. Other times it's something that's reconfigured. But I'm always trying to use the material, you know, of the site. So this first project was a collaboration with Frank Fontauzzi, a former professor and sort of ongoing collaborator of mine. We were given this house by a professor of mine, and we started to kind of dissect it. We started to kind of look at it, and well, the first thing we noticed was that it was a cinder block house. It's really you know, sort of redundant and sturdy. And we looked even further. I mean, besides, it seemed like a pretty normal house. It smelled like my grandmother's house. And we started to cut into the roof a bit, and we noticed that there was actually 2 roofs. There was originally a flat roof, and then a trussed roof was put over it, you know, potentially for this air conditioning unit here. And so we started to kind of unbuild or you know, subtract, and think about addition by subtraction, by kind of relying on this you know, redundant masonry construction system where you've got, you know, 2 over 1 and 1 over 2 in terms of the blocks. and it revealed these really beautiful conditions of you know, connections and you know, things that are usually unseen. But ultimately, we're trying to reuse redundancy as a kind of opportunity so that we can start to subtract, but still have, you know, enough matter, enough energy to support the whole structure. And so we kept unbuilding. We actually unbuilt the entire inside of the house, and then kind of if I could return to this kind of two roofs system that was there, we connected the two roofs together so that it could span the whole house instead of there being this kind of load-bearing wall down the center. And what that ultimately allowed us to do was to open the whole thing up. And we reversed the load path, the structural path, so that the whole floor was, instead of you know, bearing on something below and the roof bearing on top of that, the floor was actually hanging from above. So then that way it was then sort of moved differently, or moved oppositely, in fact. So architecture begins with the site. The site is a repository for the delineation of programmatic elements, which can only be articulated by a full processing of the site. Geographic separation of the architect and the site, however, often leads to a physical separation between the site and construct. If the architect processes the site only in 2 dimensions, the result will only be surface level development of the site and construct, leaving the two disengaged from one another. And I really appreciate the way that Peter was talking about this in terms of, you know, trying to, or not having plans. You know, he had this much cement, this much stone, but no plans. So there the architect is really working directly with the site and the collaborators. And that's generally what I tend to do. Another note about this, I hope this last part of the video was nice for you, because it was really terrible to try to capture because I was really dizzy and I almost had to puke. If that video didn't come through that well, I'll post a link in the chat.
It was okay for me. Yeah.
Oh, it was okay, great. So this is just a kind of detailed view that I think really sums the project up, because we were also kind of thinking about the building in the different layers, just like a human body, you know, where there's, you know, where there's structural layers, there's circulatory layers, there's all these kind of different components that are coming together. So just in thinking about kind of unbuilding, you know, it's the opportunity to kind of reveal these layers. Another project of mine, this was across the river in Windsor, Canada. And I was commissioned by the art museum there as part of a larger exhibition. And so I was given this neighborhood, which is called Ford City. And it's called Ford City because this is a giant Ford factory, and I believe this was actually a Chrysler factory. But this is the neighborhood called Ford City. And I was given this, or I selected this little site right here. And ironically, it's directly across the street from a scrapyard. So these two factories were mostly making minivans for a while, and it turns out that a lot of those minivans went into this scrapyard. So kind of full circle in some ways. But ultimately, this neighborhood was really, really talented at articulating metal, from building a car to crushing a car, kind of all compacted in one neighborhood. And so I started to look at the notion of compacted cars, and I noticed the normal way that cars are compacted is kind of into a cube. And I started to think about that, and think about how that was kind of unequal, because ultimately what the cube does is it makes hidden the overall size of the car and the overall geometries of the car. And so I started to the gentleman who owned the scrapyard, and he told me that he could compact a car to any size that I wanted to. So I took him up on that. And basically this crusher that they have works like a big hug. So you put the car in there, and these two elements kind of hug the car and squeeze it like a snake or something. And then there's two pistons at the end that kind of push the car into that cube. But if you don't use the pistons, then the length of the car is maintained. So although it was compacted, the cars really couldn't take any kind of structural connections. So what we ended up doing was we kind of continued that notion of the hug with this lashed connection to grab onto these angle irons at the corner here. And ultimately, what I'm really trying to do is to use the site as material, and to use kind of reorient the material in such a way that I can build something. So ultimately, we then sort of reoriented the car to gravity, kind of also revealing our phenomenological position relative to the car. And again, just trying to listen to the material and listen to the site. And ultimately, what the goal was to do was to kind of make this make the cars into these columns, and thinking about sort of factory construction that's also very, very prevalent in the neighborhood, which kind of reveals this redundant columnar process. Unfortunately for me, the opening was getting very close, and their machine broke. It was down for 2 or 3 weeks. So this night shot always reminds me of the kind of last minute actions that we had to do. There was, I wanted to do a series of mock-ups, but because their machine broke, we didn't have the time. We just kind of went for it. But ultimately, what we kind of came up with was this column structure that again kind of spoke to the redundancy of the factory constructions, but also didn't rely on any connections at the ground. It was just gravity. So basically, these elements are just kind of attached at the top without a kind of proper connection to the ground. So it really did kind of test their capacity in terms of bending and moment. But the other thing that I learned was just about that neighborhood knowledge, that kind of collective knowledge that Peter spoke about a bit. But this gentleman on the right here, he was talking. He approached every day almost, and he was talking about the different parts of the car. In this case, a minivan. And at one point, I realized that he knew all of these parts because he helped assemble them across the street. So it was this really kind of beautiful, flywheel of information. Again, some fairly beautiful details of that process. This is probably the highlight of my career, the Excess Metals company photo. The folks from across the street they were so proud of the work. No one had ever made their work look beautiful, as they told me. So they all wanted a photo of it, and I thought it was a pretty interesting cross section, because that you can tell which people are working in which position, because you've got a couple guys that look like miners, a couple folks who are very clean that work in the office, and then a couple people with sort of high vis on that sort of direct things. But ultimately, it was really important for me to then think about testing this. I guess all of my work, although experimental, I always want to try to get something out of it. And I remember that my structural engineer would not take on the project because he didn't know the bending moment of a compacted car. So I kind of helped him with that after the fact, and I tried to pull the whole thing towards this machine, as I was doing here with a tension wire, and noticed that it deflected about 5/8 of an inch with 2,000 pounds of force. So that's pretty good for a compacted car. But ultimately, to say, I'm a student of architecture. I'll always be a student of architecture. I'm always continuously curious about breaking points, about how materials react to stresses. So for me, testing is really necessary to judge the kind of cause and effect, to understand the subtleties of everything, and the subtleties that material has on space, structure, etc. So for me, testing is very much about truth. And I think this was another high point for me, was that this machine that is really designed to be a killer of all things, almost stalled as it pushed into the cars the first time. It had to get another kind of running start. So just to kind of transition a bit, those two projects, I think, represented a decent cross section of my work up until a few years ago. And again, they're kind of for me, they're very much material based site experiments that were very much impermanent. And So I took a teaching position at the University of New Mexico in the Southwest United States, and the Southwest has a radically different environment than anything that I was used to in the Northeast, and particularly around earth and construction. So I started to work with some colleagues on this poured earth system, and it's kind of in the same, let's say, language as Adobe or compressed earth. However, ours doesn't have a cement stabilizer. So it's really interesting when people say to me that that rammed earth is really green because it actually has the same amount of cement as concrete. So it's just as bad for the earth as concrete is. And so this poured earth system uses clay as a binder. That's also sort of from the earth, that doesn't need the sort of high heat in terms of pressure and sort of baking. So so we started with this poured earth system as an entry to a competition. And the initial tests here were just kind of looking at different mixtures relative to clay to aggregate and water, but also different types of clays and different types of aggregates. And the first thing, this is a kind of foreshadowing, let's say, but the first thing we noticed really quickly was that if we didn't really nail the proportion, there's significant cracking, there's significant shrinkage. And so we kept experimenting with that. We started then, instead of making kind of test bricks, we started to make small walls, only about, say, 0.5 meter by 0.5 meter in size. And again, we noticed that there was significant cracking around points that weren't allowed to move in the formwork. So one side of this formwork, on this side was plywood, the side was fabric. So the fabric allowed a certain amount of movement, but wherever the form ties were attached to the plywood, there was a pretty significant crack. And so ultimately what we decided to do was to remove the plywood, and we just started to make these kind of bags, these bladders that also could move up and down and kind of settle and move with the material. So we started to get some significantly better results, started to think about how to make openings. There still was some, depending on how we held the top, there still was a bit of cracking, but ultimately the bag kind of became this 4-dimensional formwork in that it couldn't kind of move over time, with the material. And then we went through several mixed tests and sort of tracked the durability, the consistency, and the shrinkage, most of all, and started to really zoom in on the different types of clay and how that began to affect the overall consistency of the material. But still, we noticed that the shrinkage was definitely a major issue. So this is right after the cast, this left image here, where the bladder is really being filled, and this right image is after a bit of time. And if I zoom in on the right image a bit, you'll notice that these kind of vertical lines are actually they're voids in the formwork now, because the material is starting to kind of shrink away from the formwork. So at this point, we made a pretty big jump and started, and we made a large scale, what I call, well, it's a sort of different type of test, partial full scale test. Whereas usually, if you were to make a full scale mock-up, everything is the correct size. However, this right image here, this sort of ending image, is a quarter of the size. The concrete is actually full size. The thickness of the material is full size, but the earth should actually be 4 times larger. And again, it does reveal these sort of beautiful details. And recently, I was able to get this tested as well. Up the road with COVID, some labs are finally opening up, and I was able to get these tested just the other day. So I can't even tell you how much it held, because this was so fresh. But ultimately, my true interest in this work is thinking about the site and thinking about materials that immediately come from the site. So in this diagram, the top portion here is the kind of normal path of cement and concrete. So, starting at a quarry, moving to a factory where the material is processed and heated to a high degree, and then moved, into a city and finally to your site. So that's the kind of normal concrete process. But I'm more interested in the bottom portion where you can take this idea of site as material, much further, where you can just start to extract clay and different aggregates from the earth of the construction site, process that a bit, and then mix it together with a very specific mix to begin to make buildings. So overall, it's about kind of taking advantage of what's there, of what you have, and relying on the kind of immediacy of what's around you. The other thing that's quite important for me, a bit more conceptual perhaps, is that I always feel that materials that come from the site are much more honest, right? And so, outside materials always feel a bit foreign, a bit divorced from the true nature of the immediate surroundings. So if you're using the material from the site, it always seems to fit in a lot better. I mean, even back to the cars in Ford City and Windsor, they're very much from that neighborhood. They were made in the neighborhood. They were made by the neighborhood, and so it really worked. And I guess that's all I have. I might have gone a bit quicker than I was supposed to. Oh yeah, 17 minutes. I saved you 2.5 minutes, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Concise over here. It's kind of funny.
Yeah.
It's fantastic, Charlie. Thank you. Do you want to begin by any chance with the question you had for Peter while I adjust my lighting here a little bit? Or what do you think?
Sure, I can do that. I mean,
yeah.
My question to Peter was a lot about, he mentioned site-specific at one point, and I always think about that term in terms of art and site-specific paintings or site-specific sculpture. And actually, I think that the term could be site-derived, because you're really kind of listening to the site. You're kind of using the site and harnessing as much energy that's already there as possible. So I guess I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, and to hear you kind of meditate on that for a second, I suppose.
Yeah, I actually like your term. A lot of the terms that I use, I feel like, at least from my practice anyway, it's kind of partly research, partly practice. I need new terms, but, so I'm using terms that I'm not very happy with. Like even participatory, we do participatory design, and I hate this term. Why? Because it quite often ends up as kind of lowest common denominator, like consensual low-level design. But actually, we've found out through our projects that quite often these things become contested. And in the contestation is where something has the chance to go from being low-level to actually something that nobody conceived of before, which is potentially more transformative for that particular community or whatever. So I like your term about site-derived. I mean, site-specific is this kind of tired old, dusty old term that, it's taught in every architecture program around the world. And it's like, okay, let's all be, in a kind of quasi-romantic way, let's all be sort of pay homage to Mother Earth and the whole site context, but not really sort of go beyond that, because you tick those boxes, the winds come from here, this is the prospect, this is whatever, you've done your due diligence, right? And I find that a little weak quite often. Sometimes that actually prevents students, it's probably, my failing as a teacher, but, quite often that prevents students from interrogating, questioning, finding out deeper possibilities within that. Yeah, but a lot of the terminology, even I apologize for that in my presentation, maybe it's sort of in need of a kind of renovation as well, certain kind of way.
Yeah, I mean,
that's just me. Right?
No, I mean, I thought your work was fantastic. I mean, there's so many things that transform our way of thinking about things, but I feel like the art world hasn't updated their vocabulary either. I mean, I've got this sort of ongoing I won't call it an argument, let's say discussion, with some colleagues of mine that, you know, they kind of push on this site specific, and I ask, so what, you know, how do you work? And they say, well, I look at a gallery and I make a piece. It's like, but you make the same piece for different galleries. How is that site specific? It's, you know, just because you decided that this is for that. I mean, what if you get them mixed up? It's hard not to get them mixed up. They're the same piece. So, yeah, I've always had an issue with it because, especially the way that they're using it, it just seems like it could go further. And I think in your work, I think it certainly does. So, yeah.
I think you know, the site specificity or whatever is one aspect, but you know, it's also the local capacity of the community there. So
Yeah.
it's trying to understand what is their capability, like your metal workers, right? The metal crusher guys, right? So
Yeah.
I have a question for you. So in the first project, you worked with who? Frank Fantasi, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I know him. He went to Buffalo after Detroit, right?
Yeah, I was a student of his in Buffalo.
Okay. I know him through Buffalo because I went there for a few times to meet him. Yeah.
Wild, small world.
Yeah. But the last project you did, I guess you're aware of some of the work of Mark West, right? The fabric form concrete thing or something.
Yeah, Frank actually, Frank worked with Mark in Winnipeg.
That's
So,
right. Yeah.
This doesn't have to be about Frank, but Frank went from Detroit to Buffalo to Winnipeg.
That's right. Yeah, because I was in Winnipeg before, so I was working a bit with Mark. That's how come I went to Buffalo. Yeah. Anyway, sorry about that. Yeah.
Gotcha. No, it's wild.
Happy family reunion, guys.
Yeah, apparently.
But I don't remember meeting you, but you know, maybe I was just looking the other way.
No,
I saw some of the houses, the house demolitions Frank did, you know, a long time ago at Cranbrook and so on. You know, really interesting.
Yeah. No, it's good work. I appreciate a kind of ongoing discussion with him. And I haven't seen Mark in years, but I also really appreciate his fabric form work. And I mean, yeah, I kind of came to fabric formed earth through concrete. I like to work with concrete, you know, a lot more than earth because earth it's challenging. It's really weak, and concrete is just it's pretty amazing, but it's also, you know, kind of constricting us. So I've had to kind of make that switch. So anyway.
Charlie, kind of speaking of things that are related to work that we do, and then aspects of them you get kind of allergic to. You know, one of the things I think about the so-called maker movement. You know, this kind of quasi artisanal, sometimes you know, kind of I've even heard the word lumber sexual kind of thrown around, where there's a romanticization of making as something that is kind of calling back a past of people making things for themselves and cottage industry and all this kind of stuff. And I think that's one of the things about making practice that can become kind of complicated when our work is kind of equated with that sort of thing. But I think what is at its heart, in a certain way, relates to the last diagram that you showed, where you have kind of the cutting off of the supply chain at the latter end of it, closer to the site. And I've been thinking a lot recently about how maybe part of the attraction to that is that when the making supply chain is confined to the site, it's not geographically distanced, and neither is the architect. It potentially removes some of the political complications of the work. And I was just curious if you felt like there was any aspect of that in what you do and how you practice, or, you know, is that not really a part of it for you?
No, that's absolutely a part of it. And in fact, yeah, I do think of it politically, because I think it's equally political to use what's there and not have to rely on these other materials.
Kind of like little p politics, you know, like not big P politics, but little p.
You know, yes and no. I think that I mean, if you're to look at the concrete industry, you know, a lot of these materials are very much subsidized by the government and supported by the government, and they're kind of their necessity for everyone is something that is kind of baked into the overall equation. And by by not going that route, I think it is quite political, and it's something that I think it's something that relates to our overall kind of collective impact on the earth as well. So for me, it is quite political to try to use materials that are seen as dead or are kind of from the site, because that's not part of our kind of throwaway culture. That's not part of the equation. That's not supporting it's not supporting the system of trash and dumps and other sort of taxes that have to happen to keep the wheels turning. So I do see it as slightly larger P, maybe not big P, maybe not little p, maybe somewhere in between. But it does kind of go against the grain of the system. So
I think too. Yeah, no, that's kind of what I was thinking about, and that great answer is interesting. I mean, if I was going to put this to you as kind of like a joke, I'd ask you, what are your insurance premiums looking like? Because there's kind of a politics of the site too, where you can have people coming up to you asking questions, participation of people who aren't necessarily, licensed contractors for whatever kind of work, or tradesmen or whatever else. And I was just curious too, when you think about site, this notion of accessibility before, after, during the work, how does that play in with how you conceptualize, the photo essays, the videos, everything else?
That's a good question too. I mean, I think that it kind of changes per project. Some projects are very much sort of easily accessible on many levels. Other projects are a bit more hard to get into, just in terms of their kind of, especially with the Port Earth project, a bit more scientific nature. They're certainly not as direct as kind of the pure energy of crushing a car and standing it up. I think that's a lot more direct in many ways. So I think it kind of changes. Yeah, it kind of changes per project, and also very much depends on the scale and certainly how public things are. I mean, as you know, there's some projects that happen in Detroit that are very much behind closed doors. That are, well, behind closed doors for many reasons. Safety very much being one of them. Especially in a kind of neighborhood context. But yeah, I think that's a good question, but I do think it kind of depends. It depends on the work. It depends on the content of the site, let's say, at hand, and how and how direct that contribution is, let's say. Does that answer your question though?
Definitely, thanks. Yeah, Mike, Clint, I'll kind of stop talking.
Yeah, just I don't know, comment on that. Like, two things. One is, because I know Mark West quite well, like he just started out looking at slump tests from concrete, right? That's how come he kind of went in the fabric form concrete way, more or less, as a possible sort of start, tiny little narrative of something, right? But the other thing is, I don't know about you, I don't even know if you needed to get permission for your car thing, right? Which would be kind of complicated, right? But many years ago, I was in a conversation with Andrew Freer, who runs the Rural Studio, and then he was saying that their approach was to do things kind of under the radar, because then once which I don't know if they can anymore because they're kind of overexposed, but, so you do things where there is not this whole kind of expectation of conventional outcome of, so many levels of bureaucracy and so on. That you do have the capacity to actually feel that you can experiment, you can explore, you can do stuff. And probably that's a great motivation for why I do things in, remote village in China, where there's no building inspector, there's no, we don't have these things that we don't even have a structural engineer to look at them. Right. So what we do, if we want to check something, we will design it according to our best understanding, but also get local builders who are familiar with these conditions, whether it's an earthquake area or not, to say, okay, size this a bit bigger or smaller or something. So, but this under the radar thing, I think, you know, tell me what you think, but like for me, it affords a whole much more open playing field where you can actually experiment, play around with stuff that you would feel constrained by in a, you know, highly regulated environment or conventional practice kind of mode. And I think that's essential in my view, because we've forgotten how to do that a lot in architecture, you know, play around with stuff that, I don't know, 50 years ago or 100 years ago, then people maybe did much more. How do you feel about that?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, yeah, the curator, after I had finished,
Is everyone still there? Hello?
scrutiny. The other part of that was at a certain point, we heard some pretty bad noises, like the thing was about to collapse while we were standing in it, and it wasn't a big deal. We kind of noticed that some of the connections that we had made just needed to be reinforced. So we you know, shot a bunch more nails into it, and it was fine. So I think, you know, the other thing about your comments is just that you know, that feedback loop isn't there. That when we build things permanently and you know, above board with engineers and inspectors and oversight and blah blah blah, it's so redundant. It's so stalwart that that feedback loop isn't necessary, because it's so guaranteed. But yeah, ultimately we were able to kind of, you know, listen to the project, listen to the material, and react to it. So yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that you know, working without a lot of these layers, you know, affords a certain kind of honesty and reaction to you know, to the material and the site. So yeah. Yeah, there's some great vocabulary being thrown around. Mark says that you have to get lumbersexual into your vocabulary, Peter.
Well, to me, it's interesting because you know, as it connects to, you know, the kind of the hipster phenomenon, or even before that, the back to earth movement. I think there are aspects of the maker movement that are driven by responding to the complexity of the late 20th century and 21st century by assuming that a return to making things ourselves will allow our connections to physical objects to be less politically complicated. And I think there are some suspicious kind of threads in there. And that's why I'm always interested, you know, I ask this because I think about it for my own work. I think there is an aspect of self-made, participatory, and I hate that word too, Peter. I think it's a really problematic one, but you know, work that is deriving from the site rather than from wider supply chains, that does have aspects of avoiding political complications. But yeah, I'm suspicious of it too in certain ways, because it can become, you know, is it a fantasy or a romanticization of cottage industry that doesn't exist anymore? Or is it an actual political detangling, is always my kind of question. So yeah, Clint, Mike, Peter, go ahead. I'm gonna mute myself for a while here.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. No, go for it, Clint.
I'm sorry, Mike. Thank you, Charlie. It was really interesting work. Maybe just to touch on what Peter was saying about working in a highly regulated context in terms of legislation, and I think, you know, just being back to the theme of the colloquial, you know, manifesting initiatives, and I think, you know, in Makassar we found that to be able to manifest any sort of initiative, you actually have to engage in a subversive practice, which was quite interesting. I mean, the fact that we actually carefully planned it, that all components were made, you know, in this little high school workshop where nobody could see it. So, you know, no one could ask questions. for kind of a whole week. And that's why, you know, in a week after that, we put it up into 2 days. Because once it's there, you know, it's almost accepted as, well, you know, you can't take it down because the precedent is already set there in terms of other sort of self-made spaces. And it was quite interesting that we had this counselor come afterwards asking whether we had building plans for this, and we didn't. All we did was really just to use the same footprint of the old shack, you know. So that's kind of like how we just dealt with it. But I think it's really interesting that, you know, how and I think it's part of the, you know, this idea of the challenging the inertia, the forces that we're trying to disturb. And I think this sort of how do we deal with the regulation is quite an important thing. So I kind of wanted to just put that out there. But I found it really interesting, Charlie, this kind of idea of the unbuilding, which is really kind of an anatomical study of the site or the object, which, because sort of over time, you know, the object and the site kind of merges together, and kind of the unbuilding process. That video was really, I think, fascinating, and it kind of really allows you to reimagine the relationship between structure and materials and the forces, and it sort of opens it up and sort of challenges traditional ways of assembly or bringing things together. And I find that incredibly useful to try and instill that within students who, I know in our undergrad situation, you know, I mean, it's quite challenging to get them just to do a normal sort of site analysis.
Yeah.
And, you know, like, which is quite of a tick box exercise, but I thought it was really interesting how this kind of unbuilding is a way of unpacking the site, and through that, you know, opens it up for interpreting sort of the next chapter in the story or in the life of that site. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there. You don't have to respond to anything, but I found that really really inspiring. Thank you.
Thanks, Clint. Yeah, it was thanks so much. It was great comments. I mean, the one thing that immediately takes me to is this idea of the ambiguous figure ground, and it's something that I've always been kind of you know, working towards. You know, just this idea where you can't tell the difference between, you know, where the site starts and stops and where the building or construct starts and stops. Right, just this idea of kind of merging together. And I've also found this really helpful in my own teaching, is to, you know, suggest a merging of the two, and you know, really tying the two together again, such that you can't really tell the difference. And my example of the opposite effect is are like fast food restaurants. You know, a Taco Bell just seems like it's dropped from 10,000 feet. It has no relationship to the site at all. And so, you know, it's always really helpful for me to kind of point that out to young students that are, you know, just like thinking about how to, you know, learning how to do their laundry, you know, just kind of pointing out these little nuggets of, you know, how to try to bring site together and, you know, erase the lines between. So yeah, your comments, you know, kind of take me to that area and make me think of that, but also this notion of kind of addition by subtraction. So thinking about, you know, what sort of added to a space in the act of removal, and, you know, that harks right back to Mata Clark that Peter presented. You know, just his sort of addition of knowledge, addition of space by you know, the kind of careful removal of material. So yeah, thanks for your comments.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. I think your work also reminds me of two of my other friends' work. The one guy called Jaco Boyens, he also works a lot with Earth. So he's also worked with Port Earth, but then he also recently did a rammed earth building in Namibia, which is our neighboring country to the northwest. And they started off using a 5% cement additive, and then realized they didn't have to, so they omitted the cement completely, and they were using road sub-base, like the material they use as compacted fill under tarred roads.
Mm-hmm.
And they found a whole stash of this material within, I think, 10 or 15 kilometers of the site. that's held. So they built quite a large structure with it, which is really interesting. I'll share a link with you if you're keen.
Yeah.
And then this subtraction, also really interesting. And Pete also spoke about meta clocks. So another friend is called Mo Kao. He did his PhD on essentially doing work similar to meta clock by cutting and subtracting from buildings. And he called, since we're looking at lexicons, he called it radical preservation or transformation on abandonment. So he did his PhD on it and kind of documented this process, which is also really interesting if you're still into that kind of thing. But I think about both your work, I don't know if you know a guy called David Pye. He was a professor in furniture design in the UK. He wrote about the workmanship of risk versus the workmanship of certainty. So I think both of you also engage with this workmanship of risk where the outcome isn't predetermined and it's experimental, whereas the workmanship of certainty is typically like associated with industrialized making, concrete and machine-made components, whereas this stuff requires some experimentation, which isn't always covered by legislation. And the trick is probably to get it to the point where it becomes the workmanship of certainty. Like I'm thinking of Peter's work as well, where the local residents became familiar with the process and embraced it, and now that's kind of a known system. It's kind of become a workmanship of certainty now, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, that's a beautiful book. I have that book. It's really, really wonderful to read, actually.
So we are coming up on 25 minutes. If we can kind of wind the discussion down, I think this has been really, really great. I guess I'll give our speakers kind of the opportunity to make any last comments they may have, and then Mike and Clint, you can, and then we'll kind of call it a night. Anything else anybody would like to add or contribute? Sorry, one request. Mike, could you type the name of that artist into the chat, please?
The transformation on abandonment?
Yeah, the radical preservation.
Yeah.
Yep. I'm not familiar with that one. Thank you. So Charlie, Peter, anything else you'd like to add, or?
Just to pick up on what Michael said, I mean, I think the notion of risk is really quite important. Because otherwise, what's the future of our world or those we teach? It's got to be more than just BIM, learning kind of Revit and whole procedure. I'm not saying that's not important. Maybe that is within today's world, but there's got to be a kind of outside of that world too. And, maybe I think Charlie take more risks than we did because, his kind of crazy car structure or the house where the whole floor moves, right? It's just wonderful. But the thing is that this kind of pushing some kind of limits, whether it's in a very local way or whether it's a material way, or whether it's through social engagement or through some kind of questioning of practice, I think is quite important. And you can do that in so many ways. I mean, it can be material based, can be in other ways, but always that's a part of our manifestation of our questioning, I think, at least as architects, right, or practitioners in some ways. I try to do that. I'm not always claim to be successful in that, but, at least try. Maybe when I was younger, then I'd say I'd be happy enough to do these things within a very safe context, right? Like architecture competition and so on. But increasingly, as I get old, very old, then I'm more interested in doing these things within a life living situation, like active or, full on locality situation. It's messy, it's ugly, there's things going on that you don't understand, you never will, but you try to engage those things to test out those different ideas, which clearly Michael and Clint did in the work they showed as well yesterday. Yeah,
that's well put, Peter. I mean, I would just kind of add that, I completely agree with you about the helpfulness of BIM, but also, the helpfulness of being as direct as possible and kind of listening to what you have, and kind of being a student of the site and a student of the potential energy that's around you, you know, and not forcing something. And I guess that was my critique of kind of site-specific artwork, is that, you know, a lot of the times it's lying. You know, it's saying that it's about the site, but it really doesn't have much to do with it. Yeah, I completely agree, and I'd also just like to say thanks for having me. I mean, this is this is the best discussion I've had at 5 o'clock in the morning that I can remember. So yeah, this is fantastic, and I look forward to. I missed Mike and Clint's chat the other day. I'd love to see that as well. So
Perfect segue.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks.
Oh no, thank you.
Thanks very much for organizing it.
Honestly, this has been amazing. It's great to see, you know, Charlie, I know a little bit about your work. Peter, I know a little bit about yours, and it's great to see more of it and really understand it. And Mike and Clint too. It's like seeing like-minded practitioners, people who are engaging with these questions seriously is really refreshing. And towards what Charlie just said, I posted the YouTube link again in the chat just in case anybody missed it before or when I lost the connection there for a second. And basically what we'll do is, I think within about 24 hours or so, I can have everything up on my YouTube channel, and we will use that to post to the School of Design website and social media. So hopefully we'll be able to broadcast this a little bit further over time. But I think in the interest in letting Charlie and Mike and Clint get on with their day, and letting Peter and I kind of move on to the next thing this evening, we'll call it a night there. I just want to say thank you once again to all the contributors. I think this has been an amazing discussion. Thank you for making time. Thank you for dealing with time zones. And with that, we'll call it a night if that's okay with everybody. So thanks once again.